Thanks everybody for coming, but welcome to the Fulbright New York Chapter's Women in Tech panel on mobiles and mapping toward resilience and recovery. So I'm happy to introduce Heidi Boisvert and Catherine Stickle and Alyssa Wright. And we'll have one more panelist coming, Liz Berry. We might also have some people coming in through the door here, so I encourage everyone to sort of, consider it as like a casual open salon where we can have an open discussion about things. It's not so formal, and at any point in time, please feel free to also ask questions and give comments and feedback. So I'll just open with a little bit of an introduction on what we're looking at with regards to what resilience and recovery is. So with regards to this panel, we're looking at resilience as the ability to bounce back from adversity. So with all the sort of adversity that cities have experienced with economic and natural disasters, what kinds of things are being done in the mobile and mapping fields in terms of how cities can bounce back and how we can recover, and what kinds of mobile and mapping platforms help that kind of process. And come on, you guys, welcome. So here I'm just going to go back to the Eventbrite page, which I think you've seen, but I'll reference some of the things in here because I think that they're so relevant to what's going on today, especially with the typhoon that happened in the Philippines just a few weeks ago. The online map makers were helping the Red Cross to basically direct response to the typhoon in the Philippines. So just as an example here, and this was talked about a lot within the media, but basically OpenStreetMap, a sort of a Wikipedia of maps of sorts, was crowdsourced so that people were actually mapping areas that were affected by the typhoon and tracing roads into OpenStreetMap. So this was like very much like a crowdsourced, people-sourced effort globally that helped them direct typhoon response. And along with that, there was also social mapping to sift through social media to also help direct typhoon response. So with that, they used different sorts of methods to sift through Facebook and to Twitter and those sorts of responses, and then map out exactly what to do in the Philippines, meaning what kinds of needs needed to be fulfilled. Did people need water? Did they need food? And where is that happening? So they were actually using social media in combination with maps to target areas that needed those kinds of needs to be fulfilled. So I think it's just really fascinating stuff. And then further from that, if you think back to even what New York experienced with Hurricane Sandy, there were a lot of areas that were affected, and one of the things that was built was called RHI status, which was the Red Hook Initiative status. And it was an SMS, mobile SMS to map plugin, and I'll go to the actual map here. And basically what it does is that people that were affected by Hurricane Sandy could text their needs, like I need a generator or I need water, and it would be mapped onto the map in Red Hook, and along with a community discussion thread where people could respond on the web in the community discussion thread to what they were seeing, which was being texted and then mapped on the map. So it was really interesting stuff going on. So I'm really excited to have our panelists introduce themselves. I think you'll agree that they've done some really interesting work, and then we'll talk about some case studies, and we'll be taking some Q&A after that. So I'll hand this over to Heidi Boisvert.
Hello, so I'm Heidi Boisvert, and I have a company called Future Perfect Lab, and basically what I do is I create kind of pop culture with the purpose. So I work with NGOs, cultural and educational organizations to create games and mobile applications, transmedia storytelling experiences on a host of different issues. And I do some other strange unrelated stuff, but that relates to dance and sensors and performance and stuff. But tonight what I'm going to share just very briefly is a project that I helped bring to life in terms of concept design. It's a project that Luisa Dantes, who's a filmmaker and producer, she worked on the Walmart film, she's worked on for about 7 years, shooting, archiving over 100 hours of footage after the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, creating an archive, a lot of short films that emerged out of the feature-length film that came out in 2011. And what she discovered from that process was that she ended up doing a lot of shorts to enable the partners on the ground doing the work in the redevelopment phase of Katrina, and that there really were not a lot of technologies or platform for non-siloed or shared communication. So she went on a very long, arduous journey to create this interactive platform that I'm going to share with you. And I spent some time with them down in New Orleans trying to kind of step back and reassess what is it that they actually want to create. And what we came up with was these kind of 4 modules, one of which is what I'm going to share tonight. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the mobile piece and how that will inform the project moving forward. So Land of Opportunity is an interactive, multi-layered exploration of post-crisis community and rebuilding in America. So it's not just about the post-crisis, but it's also about thinking about, can the tool be used during crisis and also as a preventative by building communities of practice, right, and shared knowledge between artists, activists, media makers, and academics or educators. So the basic, I guess, structure, as I said, it's kind of, there are 4 modes or modular elements. The first is an interactive documentary component where you can watch short clips, and then there's an embedded interactive video player where you can add contextual layers to that experience. So at root, it's a collaborative storytelling platform, right, that allows these different silos to actually tell a shared narrative of post-crisis environments. And the way in which that's done is that the content is basically you have short films, and then there are different type of layered content. So as you're viewing the content, it has a Popcorn.js plugin, right? It's built all entirely on Drupal. And as you're watching through that, you can encounter different types of triggers or nodes on the timeline that are different multimedia content. So it could be video, it could be a graphic, it could be audio, it could be a take action component. And then there are also ways of actually commenting, like in SoundCloud, as you're actually viewing that individual video. But what I want to show you back up here is, if you look, I know this screen is a little tiny, there's a little circle at the top. You can go there are many layers deep to explore the different type of video content that is creating a contextual experience of the narrative. So right now we're only 1 layer deep here, but it allows you to learn different things about the migration patterns as it relates to the content on the surface. The other thing that is really important to Luisa in terms of her goals for the project was that it not only created context around video, which sometimes is always is taken out of context, like in YouTube and certain things, but that it created a space for a multiplicity or pluralism, right? So that when, usually in post-crisis environments, what happens is, multinationals or developers come into that space, and people in the community are actually not part of the conversation around redevelopment. So part of the documentary she shot was actually exploring that process, but the idea of creating a site was to enable a space for these voices to come in prior to, right? So that we actually show, almost it's like a revisionist history, if you will. So you have that main narrative, but then you also have, it's peppered with other type of content to not only provide context, but a multiplicity of points of view, yeah? I guess I have about 4 more slides, and what I want to say is one of the core components, what she's trying to do now is, like, she's built this amazing environment, but to create sort of agency within the multiple partner organizations that are working on the ground, right, locally in different types of communities. So not just in Katrina. Katrina's kind of like a baseline, but the idea is to kind of allow others, like people who are dealing with Sandy or in the Philippines, to utilize the same platform to show the continuity or the similarities post-crisis. So the idea is that eventually, right now, the back-end CMS, they end up doing a lot of the importing of the assets and the data, but eventually they want to make it more intuitive in a way so that partners can have ownership over this environment so that it's a shared space. And then also, the site is keen in terms of the last thematic on not just providing kind of post-crisis problems that persists, but creating a space for community building around future visioning, right? Actually having a space for user-generated content on the front end where community members or even like activists can take their mobile device, right, and go into communities and shoot content that's more about future visioning, or ways that community actually see a better approach, alternative solutions to redevelopment as well as urban equity, right? So broadening beyond kind of the crisis environment, thinking about crisis in a very loose way. So there are 3 other modules which are not built out. So right now what we have is an amazing interactive web experience that provides context, multiplicity, as I said, as well as partnership engagement, right? And what's being built out now is kind of the user-generated piece, and the mobile device is going to be very key in that, right? So that we can actually, on the fly, be able to collect content in local and very rural, even rural areas where there may not be access to certain technologies. So to be able to real-time gather and push that content on the front end. So there are 2 key pieces. Once the main data or content is in there, and one is this comparative timeline, which, as I said, right now we have Katrina content and Sandy, but eventually the idea is to have many timelines and to be able to look at the 4 stages of post-crisis in terms of, like, you know, the aftermath, recovery, and future. And it would have the same nodal content, and the idea is to be able to show those alignments in terms of how there are parallel type of redevelopment efforts that go in that silence the voices of local communities, you know, as they're trying to recover. But it also is showing local actions, grassroots actions that are functioning almost like a counterculture or counter-narrative at the same time. So the idea is to kind of show these in juxtaposition, but eventually you'll be able, individuals and partners will be able to create their own timelines, right, as well as their own kind of rich context videos. And then the last piece is that we're building in is what we're calling campaign building tools. So if you notice all of the nodal content, you get video, graphic, audio, and all of these different content types. You're going to use the same data sets, right, to push content to the timeline, to push content to data viz tools, and also to push it to a template that would just be a very easy to use tool by organizations to push policy agendas. So the idea is to create a template. I had a wireframe in here, but I thought compared to the other images it looked a little messy because it hasn't been built out. But the idea is that it would just be a single snapshot, one page that could be easily, you could send a simple discrete link to policymakers on the national or the local level, and it would have the core videos of like local community voices from the videos that would be shot, as well as scrub data in terms of showing some of these comparisons between the different types of crises environments. So basically the next steps are actually building out a tool set that's even far more robust for partners, local activists, and community members that are working on the ground. Thank you. That was probably longer than 7 minutes.
That's okay. So if you have questions for Heidi or any of the other panelists, I would say just make a mental note of it and hold it, and we'll have a bit of Q&A at the end.
I'll try to make up for if you went over. I'll try to go under. No. I don't.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Catherine Stickle. I do not have slides. Slides and I are not close friends. I work for an organization that is most well known for creating a software called Frontline SMS. We have moved on to create other software. So currently you'll hear us talking about something called the Social Impact Lab, or the SIM Lab, which is an organization that we have created to kind of act as an umbrella over our projects. Frontline SMS, as I mentioned, is our most well-known product. It began in 2005, so we're now 8 years old. And it's a software that endeavors to allow people to use SMS in a more professional capacity. So we work in mostly, historically, in the part of the world that was not online. According to the best numbers that we have, and they're admittedly not very good, we know there are at least 7 billion, probably 8 billion mobile phones in the world, mobile subscriptions. But the best numbers from the GSMA last year estimated that there were about 3.4, perhaps 3.5 unique active mobile subscriptions. So what that means to us is that there is still about half the world that does not possess a mobile phone, much less a smartphone, and much less a data plan on that smartphone. So we're interested in tackling the part of the world that is communicating at lower levels of sophistication. SMS historically is the most widely used digital platform in the world. It continues to be. I SMS every day, and people in the most remote areas of the world are now often able to SMS as well. So it's very widely distributed, and as we found out in Hurricane Sandy last year here in New York, it's also very resilient itself. A lot of my friends and family have no idea what I do, and when I say I work in SMS, they look at me sideways and don't even know what that stands for, much less know what the work that we do is. But it was kind of a little bit interesting when Sandy happened last year, and the Bloomberg administration was actually encouraging people to use SMS to deliver reports of non-emergency problems to the city. People began to call me and say, oh, the green messages were going through, the blue messages weren't going through, but the green ones were. And I had to explain to them that that's text messages. Cell towers can withstand more trauma than a lot of other forms of communication wiring can. So cell towers will often remain standing after a disaster. So what we do at Frontline SMS is we build a piece of software that is meant to take the interface for text messaging out of the crappy 1-inch square phone screen that you have and put it on your laptop. So it uses just simple technologies. It uses a modem, a SIM card, and even a low-level laptop. So you can text message with large groups of people, sending and receiving text messages. And you can do much more sophisticated things than you could if you were just texting one person at a time on your phone. So you can create large groups, you can create contact groups, you send polls via SMS, you can create subscription services. The long and short of it is, in our 8 years, we've just crested 150,000 downloads. It's been used in over 150 countries, and people are running hospitals via SMS. People are doing a lot of work in disaster-affected communities. People are working with agricultural communities. The list goes on and on. We even have users in the States who are running co-ops in Brooklyn via SMS. So it's a very valuable technology and extremely valuable in disasters because it's often the only form of communication that's still standing. And it's also, even more critically, a tool that people often have. If they do have it, it's in their pocket. If you're trying to deploy technology in a disaster, it's too late. You need to be using a technology that people have on their person or hopefully have access to in short order. And we have found that low-level cell phones in the parts of the world that are most apt to be affected by truly, truly tremendous disasters with little hope of the kind of recovery that we have here are best suited by those forms of communication. A quick little plug, we have also built out, this year we released something called Frontline Cloud, which is a web-hosted version of the classic Frontline software. So it just enables people who are running campaigns in multiple countries or who want to be able to log in. If they do have web access, they can log in. And you can now deliver SMS via the web, which can be cheaper and easier. So we have Frontline Cloud, and we're also working in data studies. We have a project we're working on called Capture the Ocean, which is our effort to determine the basic data capture laws that each country in the world has. This is information that is certainly held by large multinational corporations who are deciding where to put their servers so as to either not or to protect their customers' data as much as they can, but it's difficult for nonprofit organizations and for small companies to know. So we're trying to learn as much as we can about the data retention laws of various countries and to make that information publicly available because we think it's important where all of our digital information is stored. And we know that in working in SMS, we're bringing a lot of people into the digital world, people that weren't there before. And for as many problems as we now know that we have here with respect to our privacy, we think it's really important that we're respectful of the new populations that are coming into the digital world, that we're respectful of their privacy from the beginning. So we're working on that as well. Thank you. I'm going to pull this over for you.
I'm here. My name is Alyssa Wright. I have a couple of slides, but mostly I'm here like Catherine, just to talk. I'm here representing a couple different sort of mapping affiliations. So I'm really introducing myself as me. I'm Alyssa Wright. I kind of operate in the intersection of what I would consider design, technology, and politics. And for about the last, it seems like, at least 10 years, I have been kind of in that space, building maps as a representation of what that intersection looks like, design, technology, and politics. So thank you very much for being here. It's really exciting to be around people who have had Fulbrights and interested in mapping and mobile, and on a women's panel. So thank you. I hope to participate again. And so I'm just going to go through a bit about my timeline, my personal timeline, my history, and then some of the questions with regards to when I think about recovery and resilience, and what that looks like when we talk about mapping. There are sort of two questions that I've identified, or themes that I think about in respect to those ideas. So I have a background in anthropology and cultural studies and women's studies. This is kind of where the politics comes in. I have been working in sort of a mapping space since 2007, probably a little bit before, doing some experiments, but this is the first time that I joined a group called OpenStreetMap, which is an open data repository. They call it the Wikipedia of Maps, as Josephine said earlier. And I did that for the purpose of making art, and or really just an excuse to travel around a city that I had never been to before, and collecting data and making something that I called art. This was wallpaper, it was really just an excuse to move around. So that's the art piece. I continued on with graduate studies at MIT at the Media Lab there, and my research sort of evolved into the idea of how can maps be a tool to allow us to see from other people's points of views. A book is a tool of empathy. A movie can be a tool of empathy. I think maps have the power to allow us to transport ourselves to different parts of the world, to different situations, and to connect with different people in different places. And so I think they are powerful visual tools to allow us to understand and be empathetic. And so I used this kind of concept as I explored what was at the time the parts of war in Iraq, what was that called? The blanking on words, but the fear campaigns that were going on in the U.S. How can we? Yes. The war on terror, et cetera, how can we use maps to really try to empathize? So then when we say there are so many citizens that have died in the war in Iraq, what does that actually really mean? How can we get a physical understanding of what? I have no idea what the number is now, but at the time it was 250, 100,000 people. And so now from there, I moved into a professional aspect, and now I work at an open source mapping company. And so when we look at maps, when we look at how are we doing that recovery, that tracing that you saw, there is underlying technology that's helping us, that's providing those applications. And that underlying technology has historically been closed and proprietary software, very expensive, and only the most elite of organizations and corporations and governments can have access to that software. And the ability of having open data, open government, open source, and these concepts of transparency have allowed for many different kinds of groups, as well as many different kinds of governments at all levels of development, and to have access to geospatial data and geospatial tools and analysis. And so I work within that context with a range of different kinds of customers in the federal, state, international, and corporate spaces. My specific focus is in cities and states. It's actually very U.S. focused, but I've worked on here for about within the company for about 6 years, and so I've worked in many of different aspects. So personally, I've been most recently involved in a group with the World Bank called the Open Cities Project, and this is also an open data, OpenStreetMap initiative that allows for the tracing of let me back up for a second. We take, I think, we take for granted that we can pull up Google Maps and walk around the city and we know where we're going, and maybe their trip planning is not so accurate, as I've recently have discovered, but we have high fidelity information. There are many parts of the world, and I'm sure if you've traveled on your Fulbright scholarships. There are many parts of the world that are under map, and we could consider as blank spots on the map. And so basic planning questions, such as where to place that school, where to place that hospital, what would happen and because of an earthquake, what is are really hard questions for governments and corporations actually to answer. And so there is growing initiative to support efforts of mapping these blank spots and using open source tools and open data and an international network to help build a fidelity of information. And so I've been involved in some of that work. And I guess for me, when we come to back up for a second about like what I consider as the important questions when we talk about resilience and recovery and where mapping fits in, is that I think mostly I'm more on the resilience side. I'm very much interested in like what can we do structurally and community-wise to build resilience. There is a difference between resilience and the aftermath of a crisis. And so there are two things that really inspire me when we talk about resilience. One is diversity. I really believe that whether we're talking about like the resilience of a technological piece of software or resilience of a community or the resiliency to bounce back from a crisis, it's really important. The questions of diversity are critical for answering the creation of resilience. And so I'm very much interested in what it looks like to have more women in this technology space. I think we're building tools that need to be resilient, and so having more perspectives in the room from different places, from different classes, gender, sexuality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, different parts of the world need to be part of that conversation. Otherwise, I think we set ourselves up for a lot of danger. And the other one is returning back to the empathy piece, is that in order to build resilient tools and in order to have resiliency within communities, it's, I think, important for us to think or be agile in being able to see from other people's perspectives. And so what are the tools, what are the questions, what are the conversations, and what are the dialogues that can allow us to do that? And so I think maps are really powerful ways for us to build resilience on so many different scales, and both in terms of diversity as well as empathy. And then finally, I think this is my last slide. I helped to organize within the New York City community a mapping meetup that happens once a month. The next one coming next Monday. And feel free to reach out to me, or I see some familiar faces in the crowd that I'll point out as well. So for more information, but it's called GONYC. It's part of a growing national community of mapping events within the city. And if we think of like maps as data visualization tools or as tools of empathy, where there's a ton of innovation that's happening, and almost everybody wants to put a map on it or pin on it, is what we've. And so we're part of a dialogue of I think everybody is part of like a mapping dialogue right now, and we're really looking to have a rich conversation that is diverse perspectives in the same room. Very informal, but at the same time providing like the new tools that are coming out, good questions that are happening, and so and the organizations and the companies that are supporting that and at the forefront. So look up GONYC at the meetup.com. Come to our next one. It's actually about resilience as well, with somebody speaking about the Red Hook project that Josephine just highlighted, as well as the Sahana Foundation, which works a lot in the aftermaths of crises. So, and come see me. Oh, and in February, if actually, because I think this is a good one and we need some help, we're going to do a love mapping theme if we can. So if you know anybody who's doing projects about I don't know, OkCupid, or do you? Okay. Or you've mapped your own love timeline. Yeah, or you got something to say. You got something to say about love and a map. Come talk to me, because this one I don't have any direct leads on, but I know there are people that must be doing it. So those are kind of things. Those are kind of hard questions that we try to answer at GONYC to have some good dialogue. So thank you.
All right, thanks, you guys. really interesting backgrounds, right? Am I right? So I'm really excited. So one of the things that you just brought up, Alyssa, I thought was interesting in terms of the difference between resilience and recovery. And I feel like resilience is really about infrastructure building to help the community deal with things in the future, in the present, and sort of going forward. And I also feel like recovery is much more about sort of bouncing back in the present and being more in a reactive state. So what are your thoughts around that, and what sorts of trends have you seen around that?
So regarding the differences between resilience and recovery, I think resilience, and people in my organization like to harp on this a lot in a good way. I think it's about local responders, and it's about empowering people on the ground, and you can't do that ahead of time. You can't do that anytime but ahead of time. Right. So it's very challenging, and I can see for people who are doing local budgets and for politicians who are often making budgetary decisions, it's not necessarily something that if they devote the funds to it, they're going to see the results of. And it's not as though if there was great local response done in New York last year, if there was, no one's going to say, oh, thank goodness that that Ed Koch put all that money towards our police department, because that's who we have to thank for this. So I think it's really easy to understand why the money is not always necessarily devoted to it, because it's not a sure thing, and it's not necessarily something that the people who are making budgetary decisions are going to see results on in their terms. But unfortunately, I think it is something that has to be done before the disaster happens. Recovery is something that you see people like a lot of well-intentioned multinational groups working on, and people are trying to get into the Philippines right now. Many weeks after the disaster, people are still trying to get in, and that's why I think resilience is so much more important than recovery, because the very reasons why the investment needs to be there in the first place is because the people who are there to assist with recovery can't get in because the roads have been destroyed, and the seas are too choppy to get boats in, and the air they can't land helicopters because all the ground has been destroyed, and a whole slew of reasons why recovery is so difficult. So any investment that can be made in resilience, we think is, while recognizing the challenges that people in the positions of power make in devoting those resources, that's really the only way. And there are communities that are, we know now, more prone to disasters, so probably for them it would be a great investment.
Yeah, just a real quick comment. So from my perspective, and I am no expert, and this is a very hot topic right now with people way more intelligent than I, or research than I, that can speak to it. So I just want to say, my naive opinion, that I think resilience is a lot more than just infrastructure. It does happen before a crisis, but it is a continuum. And for me, what's very interesting when considering resilience is both the there's a frame of mind, there's a perspective of like how you work together, how you build relationships, like this like kind of more amorphous thing that allows you to adjust and change and bounce back. Bounce back is a difficult definition though for resilience, but to adapt. I think there's been kind of a continuum about the idea of sustainability and resilience. Like there is relationship there, there is overlap there. So you can think of how do communities, how do spaces are able to continue after certain like trauma happens. And so these are both about structural things, and I would say infrastructure as well as like kind of, I include data collection as a specific, as well as when we consider infrastructure, but also the approach towards challenge. And these are based on the more amorphous like things about relationships or community dynamics and hierarchies and stuff like this, right? But I feel like she might be more experienced.
Yeah. I guess just very briefly, two things. I do think that part of what Louisa and the team was trying to create with the particular site is to look at how we can actually create a platform or an environment to build resilience in anticipation, right, of the next potential need to be reactive in a recovery environment. So the idea of creating these kind of palimpsestual layers, right, between one crisis to the other is to identify certain types of patterns from the data sets that emerge from doing the mapping across multiple media types, right? So the idea here is that, you know, if we can better track or map the reactive nature during a recovery environment, can we actually look at those data sets as a way to anticipate and build resilience through for the next crisis, right? Through fostering these partnerships, through a knowledge base that's around shared learning, and to identify some of these kind of it's almost like a narrative arc, right? When we're talking about kind of post-crisis environments. The second thing is I think these tools will become increasingly more critical as we enter what Bowman was talking about in terms of liquid modernity, which we see in other contexts, like in the unmapped spaces in Africa that you're talking about. But I think increasingly in what we're deeming, the first world here, I think there'll be sort of like a retro-futurist type of environment in terms of urban cities when we think about speculative decolonization in areas like Detroit and other urban centers. So I think these type of mapping devices or spaces where we're seeing a structuralist approach where we can find patterns that emerge from big data sets are going to be extremely beneficial. So hopefully that made some degree of sense.
I just like the fact that you use the word palimpsestual. Yeah. Yeah, and liquid modernity. Love it. So I feel like there's a lot of interaction that happens between the data sets when you're dealing with resilience and or recovery. And I feel like somebody had once told me that recovery is not necessarily going back to where you came from. It's about moving forward from where you are. So I feel like that sort of very poignantly sums it up. But I think it's also very interesting what happens as a result of recovery and maybe not necessarily being prepared for it, and the fact that invention is, necessity is the mother of invention. And what are some of the interesting trends or sort of emergent behaviors that have come out of some of these platforms and services and, that have been built around it? Because certainly people there might just arise the need for example, with Hurricane Sandy again, people needed to plug in. The lower half of Manhattan was dark, so the New York tech community got together and made a map that mapped different co-working spaces where you could plug in for free and just work for free and, basically like recharge. And that all happened as a result over a hacker weekend. So I feel like there's a lot of like really interesting sort of community development and emergent things that come out as a necessity of things. So what have you found in your experience?
I'd like to jump on that one. So I think the Haiti earthquake in 2009 was very much a turning point in this conversation, and you might see it differently, but at least from my perspective. And there was a great deal of effort in response to the earthquake to get information to the people that were doing recovery on the ground, and to an international effort to use like crowdsourcing data, translating text messages and requests for help. So I think that it has been the success of that has really helped to support an emergent trend of open data. And you can see, right now, from where I stand, there's a huge dialogue around the importance of allowing not only public access to data, but the government to have data that is not siloed, or that they're investing millions of dollars that's going to be outdated by the time that they really need to use it. And so having data be this tool that is engages with citizens all over the world, depending on the question, and also is constantly changing and accessible. So I think that this conversation of crisis has helped to create this, helped to support already a growing trend around the accessibility and the importance of data to make good decisions.
I'd like to say two depressing things real quick. To Josephine's point about mapping where power supply was that was done. I saw those maps, but I bet the people that didn't have any power to charge their laptops didn't see those maps. So it's a question of, and it's a question that I don't know the answer to, but we map things and I can see them on CNN in Washington, D.C. where I live, but the people who need to know where the supplies are and the people who need the assistance, they have no power. They have no access to the internet. They have no, they have radio often. So again, radio remains the killer app. No matter how not sexy it is, it's still the most important tool for a lot of communities in disaster recovery. With working in SMS, what we often deal with is communities want to crowdsource SMS reports for people who need assistance. So someone text messages in perhaps that they're trapped in a building and they're dying, and can you guarantee that you will deliver services back to them? And how, in what world are you willing to take on those reports and not be able to liaise with the police or with the medical services and deliver assistance? So it's not just about crowdsourcing, it's mostly about service delivery. So really to think hard about whether or not you're able to deliver services. And really briefly on data, again, a depressing thing to say, but it's a concerning thing to me, because we are aware that there are people that even in these times of disasters that are looking to there's no informed consent with the data that's being shared. And are we able to take tweets and to take SMS and to take reports online and to use them and to share them and to use them and pass them along without the consent of the people who have delivered them to us? And just to be aware that in my work, I know that contact information is very valuable. I know that my email address gets sold all the time because I get spam up the wazoo, and I know that in the developing world, at least, phone numbers are equally as valuable. So if people are able to collect contact information, and if it's open source, I'm concerned that that information would be bought and sold. So just to think again about data protections and about whether or not there is informed consent. And again, I don't know the answers to these questions, but they need to be addressed. Sorry.
I just want to say I was talking more about infrastructure data than like personal. Okay, good.
Yeah. I love this question around emergence and emergent behavior. And in fact, since this isn't necessarily my area of expertise, what I would like to understand better from you is what you just raised about the question of, one thing that concerns me about many of these kind of mobile-based projects is about access to tools and technologies and access to the data that's being mapped. And so, how then can we interface multiple technologies in such a way that enables, like Ushahidi did in Kenya, to take SMS data and then push it back out through radio, but in a way that's widespread enough to cause the emergent behavior that enables communities to kind of act on their own, to use their own agency to create the change towards resilience. So I guess I was wondering if there are any sort of case studies that you've come across where there are different types of interfacing of technologies that have been successful in a large-scale way that create these kind of emergent responses to crises.
The example right there that you mentioned is the most popularly distributed. Radio. Again, if you're able to interface SMS and radio, you can do a lot of good. We worked with ActionAid in Kenya in Isiolo, and they were able to, as an agency of who is working to help with recovery, were able to collect SMS reports and then distribute information over the radio, which was a very effective way to get the information out there. And it wasn't just crowdsourcing and then it stopped. But there's not a fabulous answer for a lot of people when they say, okay, I'm gonna collect these SMS and then I'm gonna map them. And I say, great, how are you the people who took the time and spent the 3 cents that they might not have to send you that SMS, how are you gonna get that mapped information? If you're able to aggregate that information on a map and make it valuable, how are you gonna get that information back to them?
Right. And
I say maybe you could print out the map and go post it in public places. And it's so non-technical and it sucks, but it's a way to distribute that information. So again, thinking about how to close that loop, there's not enough good examples of it.
I may be taking it from a different perspective. I think I naturally focus a lot on the decision makers. How is government going to make good decisions at the point of a crisis? How are they going to respond and make sure that aid is allocated appropriately? And so the the information I'm really interested in, like what's the information that can be collected beforehand? What is the information that could be crowdsourced, and to empower the decision makers to figure out where to go and send relief or how to transverse areas that may be inaccessible. And so I do think that there have been successful examples of crowdsourced information in order to empower decision makers and logistics at the point of a crisis. Wouldn't you agree? Even okay. Okay, so closing that loop might be actually not necessarily the presentation of a map, but actually closing the loop might be the delivery of the service, as Catherine was saying earlier.
But one of the things I discovered, I don't know a lot about, but I'm finishing my PhD at RPI, and there's a woman in I forget what department she's in, maybe communications and something, but her name is Barbara Cutler, and she's actually building some tools for collaborative problem solving at the moment of crises. And the reason why she's trying to build these tools is because oftentimes those key stakeholders, people in position of powers that are looking at infrastructure issues, actually are not communicating, and they're making decisions that undercut each other. Whether we're talking about water, we're talking about like the different areas, they're all very siloed. And so I think the tool she's building is very localized. It's for like local communities to kind of be all in a room physically, right, together, where you can actually problem solve and look at all the infrastructure things as an integrated system. But I think there's a place here potentially for thinking through how mobile devices and getting content on the ground can get sourced into these spaces so that the decision makers can be making more informed choices. And I think that is not necessarily happening actively enough.
So I would say also that closing loop is very much about delivering the services, but also very much about like influencing policymakers, and closing the loop with like how those decisions are made, as you all have talked about, is like such an important part of that, and oftentimes is very much on the back end of things that you don't see the results till later. So I would say, as far as policy goes, what have you all seen in terms of how crisis response has influenced policy? And then maybe inversely, how that policy has then affected resilience and strategies around that. Because I do feel like it's somewhat cyclical and also sometimes gets stuck in some of the cycles. So,
I have a very specific case study. I think this one is interesting. So, the image that Josephine showed at the beginning, where people are like tracing after the typhoon. So the way that happens, and are people here from worked with OpenStreetMap or a little bit? Okay, so you have this aerial imagery, and then you trace it, and so you would trace like what a road looks like, maybe before a disaster or after disaster, but it's called this armchair mapping, and it's based on this aerial imagery, and a lot of that aerial imagery is proprietary information, very, very expensive, owned by fancy satellite companies, and so after Haiti, there was aerial imagery that was released, and people were able to trace it and make a more accurate map. And the power of that really inspired and shifted and influenced decision making at the State Department. And so they now have this initiative called Imagery for the Crowd, where both in terms of disaster response as well as for resilience building, they have, I think, 3 different areas of the world, one being Kathmandu, Nepal for earthquake planning, the other one being in the Philippines in response to the typhoon, and then the third, I'm blanking, but I believe it's in Africa. It might be Senegal in Africa. They're providing aerial imagery to communities, to like publicly, to map and trace those spaces, with the idea of helping to build city planning and resilience before and in response to a crisis. And so I think that's been a really a successful example of a change that's happened. I forget what the original question was, but this is related. So, okay, good.
Can you just go a little bit further? Sorry, I didn't
Sure.
read this. around like the traces. So what are so if communities are actually doing, so there's the aerial view, and then the communities are gaining access to that, and they're doing the tracing. What are they tracing? Are they tracing the decisions that they're making around how to utilize the resources in the land? I mean, what are some of the decisions that are being made?
If you go back to my PDF, the second to last slide. So
because the reason I asked, I'm actually glad that you brought this up.
One of the areas in Kathmandu, Nepal, and this is what I traced. So if you see on the lower right-hand corner, that's aerial imagery that I sat in front of and then traced all the buildings so that they could do earthquake models for the valley, because it's at high risk for an earthquake. Before I sat and traced all those buildings, and this is just a tiny bit of a place that has like about 1 million buildings. Before I did that, there was very limited structural and engineering information available to the state and country government. So this was about resilience building, so that they could do better earthquake planning and response. At the time of a crisis, a similar thing would happen, both with infrastructure data that's like from before the crisis, but then also you would see how did like the road change, like is that bridge still up after the crisis, and so you get up-to-date imagery right away. And so when I say communities are mapping it, it's usually communities in terms of the response to a disaster. It's usually communities that are outside of that disaster's area that are contributing and crowdsourcing information. When it comes to sort of resilience building, what's critical is that you have on-the-ground teams that are building that data set, and that are responsible for it as it shifts and changes.
Mm-hmm. But are they also able to insert their point of view and their vision about how to restructure and rebuild those communities that have been devastated?
No, I mean that's not what this. That's not what this platform is about.
No, because I think the question you raised even at the beginning around, I mean, part of the problem is that these sort of mapping or these kind of government data sets are not open environments, and so then communities don't actually have the proper data to be making informed choices or to organize around how they actually want to insert themselves within those local communities to, rebuild cities that they want to live in, right? So
so this is
what I'm concerned about most.
Well, I mean, what I think is interesting about this is like a conversation about OpenStreetMap essentially, and like what's powerful about OpenStreetMap, as opposed to I was speaking to somebody earlier about Google Map Maker, is that the communities do have access to that data because it is an open database. Right. So they can they can build on top of it platforms for conversation and influencing planning.
It's funny, what I love about this though is, in the 19th century they had something called chorographic maps, which were actually local communities would make maps, but they were from the point of view of actually walking through and having connections with landmarks in those environments. And then, the 19th century happened and we got surveying in this aerial perspective, and colonization and all these things emerged. So I think what's very interesting is that you're almost going back to like the physical trace, the act of making a mark in land based on the community on the ground perspective, which I think is brilliant.
So I'm going to open it up to the audience right now. We've had a really nice discussion, but I know that some people may have some questions. So do we have any questions?
I have a question for Heidi. The tool that you've been involved with sounds amazing, and I have some questions about the assumptions. And it sounds to me that it's almost sort of like a journalist or a ground level citizen journalism effort where anyone post-Katrina can report on what they're seeing from their perspective to create these layers that are part of the tool. And I'm wondering, by design, are you welcoming any participant, or are different participants encouraged at different phases in the timeline?
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat the question just in case for audio later. So with regards to the Land of Opportunity platform that Heidi was talking about, are they encouraging anyone to participate, or is it limited to a certain audience? Is that what your question was? And to elaborate on that.
Yeah, Actually, that's a really good question, because we spent a lot of time talking about the ethics of how do we phase in different types of user access. And so that is still somewhat undecided, but I think what emerged from that conversation was actually that right now, in terms of the platform, there are partners that have been sought out within these particular thematic areas, and they have access, you know, and they'll be trained on the back end to create the content and also curate the content. And then there'll also be partners in terms of limited functionality, where user-generated content can be created on the front end and sort of commented on in a way. But you can also potentially create like a profile where you'll be able to create your own timeline and this and that, but it may not go be, I guess, pushed in a way to the curated content that's showcased on the front end. So I guess to answer your question is that there are multiple modalities of user access, but the idea is to try to create, you know, almost a revisionist, pluralistic approach to mapping the story, right? I think the thing here was like, is there a way actually to do personalized storytelling and then somehow integrate that, right, with this kind of very data-centric environment to make it useful, right, for the actual purpose of rebuilding and anticipating. So, yeah, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a kind of a question, because I'd really like to get some feedback. My name is Abby Semple, and I've been doing mapping for a long time. And it was a 9/11 project, and it's called Culture Now. But what we started to do is to document cultural assets. And after Sandy, it got to be a huge deal, because suddenly we were the only people with public art collections of historical buildings. And Oklahoma City, for instance, after the tornado, started putting all their stuff up. So I really would like to get some thoughts, because we're suddenly developing this huge national database. And I'm not real sure what to do, because our little cloud, wherever it is probably not the place to do such an important thing. And I'd like to hear what you have to say, because you've all got different platforms, and each one does a different thing. And I didn't know we were going to be a big resiliency issue, but suddenly we have more content than anybody else, and it's a problem, not only ethically, but you know, what do you do? How do you protect it, and then how do you tell people that you have it, and then how do you use it?
Right. I think that some of you also touched on that as well. Yeah. So the question from Abby is like, with these huge data sets that we're amassing, how do we deal with it data, like with the management of it, with the security of it, with the and of course like with the different laws internationally. So yeah. Who's a librarian? Who's in charge here?
If I may, is it the size of the data set that you're worried about, or is it the value of the information that you're holding?
Became really useful after Sandy, because suddenly FEMA, we were the only ones who had all the information that illustrated New York City's historical buildings, and overlaid with the art collections, overlaid with a lot of the important planning projects. So it was the only place that it was all in one place.
Are you interested ultimately in making this information as publicly available as possible, or is it something that you want?
Well, it's totally available.
It is totally available.
Yeah, it's all
And you want to keep it that way?
Yeah.
Do you know which cloud hosting service you use? Do you know where their servers are stored? That's something you should look into.
I don't know, because like every time there's an issue, I mean, my American Express card just, needs a little upgrade or something. I don't know.
That's something to look into.
Yeah, exactly.
The veracity of both the cloud service, and there's some are better than others, and I can tell you some of the good ones, and finding out which of the cloud services have their server stack in a place that has data protection laws that you would find meshed with what you want.
For Los Alamos.
I mean, I would love to talk about like maybe the specifics of the the art data, the art assets. Maybe after the panel, but I can think more generally that there are at least 3 options that you have most immediately. So, I mean, if the larger question is like if outside of your specific data set, but people are collecting data for specific community concerns, and they become useful in different types of situations. Like, how do they how do you make sure it's not siloed, or it's it's available to the right decision makers? Anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that for this art data, it seems to me that it could you could incorporate that data into this larger OpenStreetMap data set, and then it would be part of there's a great deal of like building asset data that's in OpenStreetMap already that's being used for decision making in New York City, and so it could be incorporated into a larger data set that's already that already exists. It could be brought into a city-specific workflow, and as they have like these open data initiatives, and if people have seen like the data.nyc, is that what it's called? And so you can add to those open data sets. And then the third would be to have it continue like as your own hosted platform, and then to consider what are the ways to make it most resilient and accessible and interoperable for other decision makers. And so looking at where it's being hosted, making sure that it's maybe in a standard that can be ingested by other platforms or other tools. I mean, so those are sort of, I see, 3 most immediate options for how to work with if you're collecting data that seems to be relevant in the resilience and recovery space.
Yeah, I mean, I actually want to better understand what the data is in terms of how is it represented, because I think part of the question is also about display and access. I mean, in terms of their artifacts, and you've captured them, but they've disappeared or disintegrated. I'm sort of trying to understand.
It's what we've been doing a lot of mapping, and mapping changed since 9/11. So as the content moved online, we made a lot of maps.
What is the content, though? I mean, what is the content?
The content is basically, they're cultural and historical maps. So basically, what it is 75 cities' public art collections. There's a lot of historic buildings.
But they're images or they're representations? Or
representations, and it's tagged to places. And there's a lot of podcasts. There's about 1,100 podcasts.
And are those places still in existence?
Oh yeah, like the World Trade Center. There's a lot
I guess
of that.
part of my brain
question
started
is
to go
really
is like, is it an issue of sort of display and sort of like cultural representation in a way? And, could augmented reality or things like, is it a display issue, or is it more about like cultural preservation in terms of the data sets that no longer exist if our technologies change?
No, I'm not. We're using it as a design tool for designing for resilience, and it suddenly became a really important once we started to layer all the information that a lot of cities have on top of each other, which you can do now, so that your iPhone find everything that happens in a place.
Right.
And it's all kind of overlaid.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it would be an amazing, walking kind of a Seven Scenes type, walking experience with, augmented reality overlay with images and sounds, but to show the stacking that occurs, so it's a palimpsestual also. Yeah, sorry, I had to use the word again.
I'll learn that.
So I guess I was wondering if it is a question of display or if it's about preservation.
I think it's between preservation and using it as a design tool.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. There's 2 more questions, I guess. Go ahead in the front row.
That's okay. I'll try to be quick. My first question is for the first 2 things. If your projects are open source, and if the links are on I'm assuming they're on the Eventbrite. I just probably didn't click on all of them, but if they're open source. And also for the second, for the SMS tools, are you building like a mapping platform, or are you just allowing people to take that data and try to map it, or is that not related to mapping? Is that more the mobile aspect of the thing? Actually, if I can tag on, because I think my question is related to your question. Where are you getting the kind of original data sets from, like the original maps? Are they like from federal agencies? Are they from like Earth-facing satellites? Are they proprietary? Like, you know, NOAA has like Earth-facing weather satellites, right? And then you update all of this stuff.
So the first question was, are the projects open source? And I think you had a second part of the question that maybe I lost a little bit. Are they online? Yes. The answer to that is yes. They're on the Eventbrite. I believe I have everybody's links and websites and Twitter handles on the Eventbrite, which is where you registered through, and also, you know, everyone's available after the panel to keep talking about that. The second part of the question was where is the data actually coming from? Where are the data sets originating from?
FrontlineSMS.com. It's open source. It's free. The Frontline SMS software. It's available for download on the website. And as far as the mapping goes, we are not mappers, so we leave that to the mappers. We are very close friends with Ushahidi, and we've actually built. Oh, great! Frontline SMS is back-ended into Ushahidi, so it's all done for you. So if you're working within the software, you can export everything automatically to their mapping software.
And Land of Opportunity, yes, there's a website that I had shown. It's landofopportunityinteractive.com, I believe. It's still in beta. It is all open source. It's built on Drupal, and it has a Popcorn.js integration. The second phase, when the idea was to build it flexibly enough so that the goal actually is to create a platform that's extractable, meaning that other, you know, NGOs or organizations that would want to use the same type of interactive video player and this type of content, the way that it's set up, could actually use it in a way. But right now, the way it's been designed, it's still based on a theme in a sense, so it's not as modular and extractable as it needs to be, but the idea is to move it to a more flexible environment.
Okay. All right. New York Cubed. Uh-huh. Okay, so something to check out, NewYorkCube.com. So no, I'm glad that you mentioned that you were at Ushahidi. Actually, that was one of the things that I meant to bring up too, is that I think that Ushahidi was one of the first DIY platforms for doing like crisis crowd mapping, right? So. Yeah. We have an extra chair. Yeah. So that's definitely something that's very sort of relevant to everything. Thank you for asking. So one of the things that I wanted to close off with too was, how can map makers and mobile developers support the community so that resilience building does happen, and inversely, how can the community support mobile developers and map making to help sort of bolster each other's efforts? Sure.
I tend to think about this in a more international way. Make things free, make things easy to download and accessible. If they are online, make them light and flexible so they don't take up a lot of space on low-end computers. Make things in as many languages as you possibly can, and make things that are built don't just build mobile apps for iPhones. Think about the other devices in the world, but accessibility is key.
Yeah.
I guess mine is more of a philosophy of design, or maybe a theory of change in some sense. But usually when I start working on a project with clients, what's important to me is using open or participatory design practices, inviting in what I call a meshwork of influencers. So inviting community stakeholders from a whole diverse array of issue sets to actually co-design whatever tool is being built through a very, methodological process that I've invented. So to me, in terms of building the right tools that are beneficial and useful to the community that you want to deploy them in, begins with the design process very early on. So.
I think I just want to ditto what was said before. Yeah, it's again accessibility, collaborative and agile practices when developing tools. I think these are all really great ways to build technologies and relationships as well between mappers and communities.
Yeah, so I would basically echo what everyone said as far as making things accessible and free, and I would also say that I feel like it comes down to also just making space for things to happen, whether that space is like making space in the community for it to happen, or making space in our sort of technological processes for that to happen. So like one thing I was thinking about, and you brought it up earlier, Heidi, was a friend of ours has a platform called 7 Scenes that's like a DIY mobile storytelling platform. And basically I feel like making the space for people to tell their stories and to map things and to access things on their mobile so that they can create their own sorts of stories and their own meaning from the data. But one thing that I saw them using that I thought was really interesting was just recently I was at a tech camp. I met Catherine at a tech camp in Mumbai. Oh, and you went to tech camp? Everyone goes to tech camp. So I was at a tech camp in Palestine, in Ramallah, and some of the participants wanted to make a storytelling, a mobile storytelling game that encouraged sightseeing in Ramallah, because Palestine has sort of this reputation for being a very dangerous conflict zone. So how can we use these sorts of platforms and services to tell a story about tourism and to make people more open to sightseeing around Ramallah and include it in their travels and voyages? So we created a little sightseeing game where they would go to a certain point, and they would go to a location and get points, like 5 points or 10 points, and accrue points through that game. And then an image or video would pop up about that particular location. And I feel like that's a really interesting use of it that I would not have thought of, that encourages kind of this almost like a rebranding of a conflict zone that I feel like reflects really well on resilience. But so yeah, that's a long story to say that I think that just making space for things to happen and creating these open spaces for hacking, for play, for discussion, for town talks. So I want to wrap up by saying thank you to our stellar panelists this evening, to Alyssa Wright, Catherine Stickle, Heidi Boisvert, and I realized I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, Josephine Dorado, on behalf of the Greater New York chapter of the Fulbright. Thank you so much for coming. Please stay around, talk to us. We'd love to hear comments and further questions. Have bunches of drinks. Thank you also to the Delancey for lending us this beautiful space. And everyone have a good night. Thank you.